Have you ever walked past a building and felt something you couldn't explain? Not fear exactly, but a quiet pressure in your chest, as if the walls themselves were watching you. What if that sensation wasn't imagination at all, but recognition? Recognition of intention. Because throughout history, architecture has never been neutral. Every corridor directs movement. Every window controls perspectives. Every shadow exists because someone designed it to exist. And what if some buildings were never meant to comfort, inspire, or protect, but instead to dominate, conceal, and manipulate? Welcome to Mr. Whisper's Official, where we explore the hidden stories buried beneath ordinary reality. Tonight, we are unearthing architectural anomalies, structures whose disturbing aesthetics are not accidents of style, but deliberate instruments of control, deception, and secrecy. If you're fascinated by the dark psychology of design and the unsettling truths hidden in plain sight, subscribe now. Because some buildings don't just stand, they remember. Across the world, certain structures provoke unease that transcends appearance. People describe them as oppressive, suffocating, disorienting, not merely ugly, but wrong. Consider the looming fortress like Focade of Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. At first glance, it resembles a medieval castle, complete with turrets and intimidating stone walls. But this resemblance was intentional. When it opened in 1829, its architecture was designed not simply to imprison bodies, but to break minds. The structure's radio layout allowed a single guard to observe multiple corridors from one central hub, creating the constant illusion of surveillance. Prisoners never knew when they were being watched. Silence was mandatory. Isolation was absolute. Even the skylights were placed high above cells, called the Eye of God, reinforcing psychological submission. Visitors today often report overwhelming dread, not because the building is abandoned, but because its geometry still enforces emotional pressure. Then there are massive brutalist government complexes built during the Cold War era. Enormous concrete blocks with narrow windows and labyrinthine interiors, designed less like civic spaces and more like defensive strongholds. Their scale dwarfs the individual. Their repetitive forms disorient perception. The heavy materials absorb light and echo footsteps in ways that amplify vulnerability. Architects often describe these choices as expressions of strength and permanence, but critics argue they also functioned as instruments of intimidation. Architecture that communicates authority through physical dominance. Buildings that remind visitors they are small and being observed. But perhaps the most disturbing realization is this: unsettling architecture often feels wrong because it is working exactly as intended. Psychological response was engineered into the blueprint. Fear is not an accidental byproduct. It is structural, which raises a chilling question. How many buildings around us were designed not just to shelter human activity, but to shape human behavior in ways we cannot consciously perceive? And if structures can influence emotion, what happens when that influence is deliberately malicious? Tonight, we follow the blueprints of control, deception, and concealment to uncover architecture that didn't merely witness darkness, but helped create it. Concrete does not breathe. It does not soften. It does not age gracefully. It endures heavy, immovable, absolute. Brutalist architecture emerged in the mid-20th century with promises of honesty and functionality. Yet in many contexts, it became something else entirely, a physical language of dominance. Massive monolithic forms, minimal ornamentation, deep recesses that swallow light. Interiors arranged not for comfort, but for surveillance and control. At its most extreme, brutalism mirrors a philosophical belief that human behavior must be regulated through environment. Few design concepts embody this more clearly than the panopticon, first theorized in the 18th century by philosopher Jeremy Bentham. A circular prison where a single central watchtower could observe all inmates without them knowing when observation occurred. The result was psychological. Prisoners internalized surveillance. They behaved as though watched, even when alone. Variations of this principle appear in multiple prison designs worldwide, including London's Pentonville Prison and numerous 19th century penitentiaries, influenced by radial layouts. The architecture itself becomes an enforcement mechanism. Walls become authority. Space becomes discipline. And then there are structures like the Pruitigo housing complex in St. Louis, initially envisioned as modernist progress, but criticized for its isolating corridors, blind stairwells, and poorly supervised communal zones. The design unintentionally fostered anonymity and reduced accountability, creating environments where crime could flourish unseen. Architecture did not merely fail its residents. It created conditions that enabled social breakdown. Even more chilling is the psychological effect of sensory deprivation embedded into many institutional buildings. Narrow windows limit external orientation. Uniform corridors erase spatial memory. Artificial lighting disrupts circadian rhythm. Disorientation weakens autonomy. When individuals cannot easily map their environment, they become more compliant, more dependent. More controllable. This is not theoretical speculation. Environmental psychologists have long documented how spatial design influences cognition and emotional regulation. In some historical interrogation facilities and detention centers, architectural monotony and spatial ambiguity were deliberately intensified to induce anxiety and learned helplessness. The building becomes a silent participant in coercion, a collaborator without voice, a machine made of geometry and shadow. But the most unsettling aspect of brutalist environments is not what they show, but what they conceal. Windowless floors, restricted access corridors, structural masks that muffle sound. Concrete is an excellent acoustic insulator. Conversations disappear. Movements remain hidden. Secrets become structurally protected. When architecture prioritizes opacity over transparency, it becomes a perfect container for activities meant to remain unseen. And perhaps that is why so many people describe certain concrete megastructures as emotionally suffocating, because somewhere deep in our perception, we sense what they were optimized to do. Not inspire, not comfort, but contain, observe, and suppress. If brutalism intimidates through severity, Baroque architecture overwhelms through excess. Curving facades, gilded ornamentation, intricate ceiling frescoes, spiraling staircases, mirrored eyes, visual complexity so dense that attention becomes fragmented. Every surface demands focus. Every detail competes for perception. But what if that sensory overload serves another purpose? Distraction? Distraction. During the Baroque period, architecture became theater. Buildings did not simply function. They performed power. Palaces such as Versailles in France dazzled visitors with grandeur so immense that orientation became secondary to spectacle. Yet hidden within that splendor existed an intricate network of concealed passages, private corridors, and restricted chambers allowing rulers and courtiers to move unseen. Surveillance and secrecy embedded within beauty. One of the most fascinating examples is Florence's Palazzo Vecchio, where secret passageways allowed political leaders to escape or eavesdrop without detection. These hidden routes were not architectural accidents. They were integrated into the structure as planning from the beginning, a spatial system for invisible movement. Baroque estates often functioned as controlled environments where visibility could be manipulated at will. Guests saw what hosts wanted them to see. Nothing more. Now consider perhaps the most infamous architectural deception in American history. H.H. Holmes' so-called murder castle in Chicago during the 1893 World's Fair. Externally, it appeared as an ordinary commercial building with decorative features typical of the era. Internally, however, its layout was deliberately chaotic. Soundproof rooms, windowless chambers, hidden chutes, secret staircases leading nowhere, doors that locked from the outside. Homes exploited architectural confusion as a weapon. Visitors became spatially disoriented. Escape routes were obscured. Movement was controlled entirely by design. Here, architecture did not merely conceal crime, it enabled it. The building itself functioned as a mechanism of predation. What makes Baroque deception so effective is psychological misdirection. Ornamental richness signals safety, wealth, sophistication. The human brain interprets decoration as evidence of civilization and stability. But when visual noise becomes overwhelming, analytical perception weakens. People stop mapping structure. They stop questioning function. Beauty becomes camouflage. Complexity becomes concealment. And perhaps this is why some of history's most elaborate residences housed not only luxury, but conspiracy, surveillance, and quiet manipulation. Because the more a structure dazzles the eye, the easier it becomes to hide what lies just beyond attention. Sinister architecture did not disappear with historical empires. It evolved. Modern structures often conceal control not through grandeur or intimidation, but through isolation and minimalism. Consider remote compounds built by authoritarian groups or insular communities. Their layouts frequently emphasize separation from external society, limited access roads, centralized gathering zones, restricted sightlines, and controlled housing arrangements. Spatial organization reinforces hierarchy. Leaders occupy central or elevated positions. Followers remain distributed in patterns that simplify monitoring. Physical environment becomes social structure. The Jonestown settlement in Guyana, established by Jim Jones, exemplified this. Though appearing as a rural community, its spatial arrangements centralize authority while limiting private autonomy. Movement was observable. Communication was monitored. Physical isolation reinforced psychological dependency. Architecture did not merely house ideology, it enforced it. More recently, investigators studying various cult compounds have identified recurring spatial patterns. Perimeter control, inward-facing structures, minimal external visual connection, and communal spaces positioned to maximize supervision. Even minimalist architecture, often celebrated for serenity and simplicity, can produce psychological effects when combined with extreme isolation. Large, empty interiors, monochromatic surfaces, absence of visual anchors. Sensory reduction can create calm, but also detachment, disorientation, and emotional flattening when prolonged. In certain controlled environments, minimalism becomes environmental control through sensory deprivation. Some contemporary institutional buildings, detention centers, experimental facilities, high-security corporate campuses incorporate spatial strategies that limit navigational clarity. Long identical corridors, restricted transparency, controlled lighting cycles. When individuals cannot easily interpret their surroundings, autonomy weakens. And in extreme cases, architecture can become a behavioral conditioning system, operating continuously without direct human enforcement. The building itself becomes regulation. What is most unsettling is how ordinary many of these places appear from the outside. Clean lines, neutral colors, functional layouts. Nothing visibly sinister, because modern architectural control rarely announces itself. It is subtle, embedded, invisible to casual observation. And perhaps that is the defining anomaly of contemporary sinister design, its ability to look perfectly normal, while quietly shaping human experience in profound and sometimes disturbing ways. Across centuries, styles have changed, Materials have evolved. Technologies have advanced. But one principle remains constant: architecture shapes behavior. It directs movement, influences emotion, structures perception, and controls visibility. And when those capabilities are used intentionally for harm, buildings become more than passive environments. They become from the surveillance geometry of penitentiaries to the deceptive splendor of palaces. From the weaponized confusion of Holmes' murder castle to the isolating layouts of modern compounds, a pattern emerges. Architecture can conceal truth, enforce obedience, enable secrecy, and amplify power, all without speaking a single word. Which means the most disturbing element of sinister architecture is not its appearance, but its intention. The knowledge that some moment in design history, a human mind envisioned space not as shelter, but as strategy, not as protection, but as control. So the next time you stand before a building that feels inexplicably unsettling, pause, observe the windows, the corridors, the symmetry, or lack of Italiano. Ask yourself, who benefits from the way that space is arranged? Who can see and who cannot? Who moves freely and who is directed? Because architecture is never just structure. It is encoded purpose, and sometimes hidden beneath stone, steel, and concrete. That purpose is deeply, profoundly dark. Thank you for exploring these architectural anomalies with Mr. Whispers Official. If this journey changed the way you see the world around you, subscribe, because the most disturbing truths are rarely buried underground. Often, they are built right in front of us.